Hey, good morning, everyone. It's March 26th, and that's a Monday, which means here around the Vote Common Good world, we talk about what's going on in the news. My name is Doug Padgett. I get to be your daily host, and I am in Minneapolis, Minnesota, standing up today downstairs in the basement studio. Let us know where you're coming from, and you may be paying attention to news items about Minneapolis. Today starts the trial related to the murder of George Floyd. Former police officer Derek Chauvin is in trial. Opening statements started about a half an hour ago. So in a lot of ways, people are reliving the pain of police brutality, the murder of George Floyd, and the difficulties that will bring. And I'm just a few miles from there, and there's something that just happens in the spirit of a city when you're faced with these kinds of struggles. So this will be a trial that is scheduled to go on for a month or longer. We'll be commenting in and around it as we go through the Vote Common Good podcast over the next month, and just want to hold together all the pain and the struggle and the difficulty that is at stake in this trial. So I'm going to feel that very heavily. But today our news story is not specifically about that. Our news conversation, it's actually one about what's happening at the border. One of the perennial issues that seems to face us in our society. And I am so excited to have Johana Bencomo here. I'm a big fan of Johana. Johana, so good to see you. Johana is many things in the world. She is a congressperson from Las Cruces, New Mexico. One of the great, right? Did I have that right? One of the great.
No. You're putting stuff into the universe that's not there yet. City councilor.
Oh, city councilor. What did I say?
Congressperson.
Congressperson, a city council person from Las Cruces, New Mexico, but soon to be the congresswoman from New Mexico. But the city council person from Las Cruces, New Mexico. And if you have never been to Las Cruces, New Mexico, I promise you, it is worth going. It is one of the great places, fabulous people. The air is different. The sky is different. The land is different. It's all the hopes. It's a border city. Right next to, a lot of people know about El Paso, Texas. It's the city right on the other side of the New Mexico-Texas border. And Johana is also the executive director of CAFE, and CAFE is a part of the Faith in Action Network. And so she's a local organizer of faith workers and social activists in the New Mexico area, and really interconnected all over the country. So Johana, so good to see you. And do you want to announce your run for Congress today, since I already spilled the beans, or is that something?
Yeah, you broke the news. Okay. No. Thank you, Doug. Yes, I'm so excited to be here. I met Doug in the Vote Common Good bus crew, I don't know, a couple years ago at this point. Time is weird. But yes, I'm the executive director of New Mexico CAFE, which stands for Comunidades en Acción y de Fe, or Communities in Action and Faith. And yes, a city councilor here in Las Cruces. So very happy to join you today.
And newly elected. So we'll talk a bit about that, about how someone decides that they want to serve their city, want to serve their community, and wants to do that through the apparatus of the city or state or federal government. That's a big thing. But first, let's talk a little bit about what's happening on and around the border. It's obviously something that we're talking about yet again, and we need to talk about it. Immigration has been a central part of the American story. It's crucial. But a lot of people kind of feel like that we're in this intractable conversation. In fact, it's even come up now that, hey, look, every spring, a whole lot of migrants come and try to cross the border, and it's never going to change. And there's this feeling that we're stuck. Republicans want to militarize and blockade, and Democrats want to engage with the people and solve problems that exist for asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, and so on. And people feel like we're just stuck. It's not really going to get anywhere. And having been with you and the people who live and work along the border, I have been so encouraged to realize that while so many of us who live in other places, I live in a border state on the other side of the country with the Canadian border, we're a long way from there. It can just sound and feel like, oh, nothing's ever going to change, until you meet all of you people and you realize not only is there hope, but you all have the actual solutions to what needs to happen there. So can you just talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing, what you know the lived experience of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants are, and where the hope really lies for this, so that the news story becomes something broader and better than what So it's frankly just more truthful.
Absolutely. I'm so excited we're having this conversation, Doug. And I'm really excited that Vote Common Good is drawn to this conversation, and particularly to engaging people who are directly impacted by this, people who live here in the border. And you named these two polarizing sides, right? Republicans, Democrats. And at the center of it really is us, the people who live here, the people who call this place our home. And we have this saying in organizing that says the people closest to the pain are the people closest to the solution. And I deeply believe that about border governance and border policy. And we absolutely believe that there's hope. And we actually believe that we don't have to reinvent any wheels. Borders exist all over this world. There's some places that do borders way better than the United States, and frankly, even Mexico. But this is where I live. This is where we live. This is my reality. And, for a really long time, Doug, the strategy in Congress in Washington, D.C. has, number one, been to ignore us at the border, right? To not consult with us. But then two, to really marry border governance with immigration reform. And we actually believe that that's where our demise has been. They're two very separate conversations, actually. Border governance should live on its own. Immigration reform should live on its own. How we treat asylum seekers and refugees should live on its own, right? Those are all really different conversations that Washington, D.C. has said, well, it all is about brown people, so let's just all lump it together, right? Like, that's really what it's the bottom line. And, we really believe that those two conversations should be divorced. And we should talk about border governance just as that, because for far too long, we've, DC and members of Congress and the administration has said, well, we'll do trade-offs. And so for a really long time, actually decades now, immigration policy has gotten stricter, and our border communities have gotten more militarized. And that's not just unwelcoming for new strangers arriving at our borders. That's dangerous. It's unwelcoming for those of us that live here as well. And you know exactly what that means here in our communities. It's the presence of Border Patrol and internal checkpoints and many other things that I'd love to dig deep with you on today.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that. The idea of separating border policy from immigration policy was something I learned from you actually a couple of years ago. And I had never even considered that those would be different things. For whatever reason, now it's a little clearer to me that the decisions we're going to make about who we're going to allow in the country is an immigration question on under what sets of circumstances. Setting aside asylum seekers and refugees, I just want to parentheses that for a moment because it's really important to know the different. Well, let's talk about that right now, okay? So just so I can get it off my brain at least. People hear this asylum seekers, in order to seek asylum in the United States, as far as I understand it, a person has to be on United States soil. In other words, they can't do it from Guatemala. You can't ask for asylum from your home country or from Honduras or from El Salvador. So if you're in a situation where you want to seek asylum, you have to get to U.S. soil and put your foot on U.S. soil. Back in the 1980s, there was like when Russians were seeking asylum in the United States, like they would get to U.S. for some reason, like a chess tournament, and then they would seek asylum, right? Because they could only do it here. That's my, that's an old man's memory of asylum seekers. So when people currently are crossing the border, they're not crossing the border to avoid detection. All of these people we're talking about right now, say they want someone to find them. They're crossing at a border checkpoint and saying, I want to seek asylum. To call that the same as people who are coming across the Rio Grande and sneaking in and they just want to break the system, they're actually the law-abiding people that are following the law and the system. So asylum seekers cross for different reasons than a migrant who's seeking a work visa or a visiting visa or a family visa. And that's different than somebody who's trying to get in the country and doesn't want anyone to know that they came in the country. So all of that is convoluted. And then you say, Well, then what's border security about? And border security sort of attacks all of these people with the same energy, right? Whether you're legally asking for asylum and doing the right thing by stepping across the line or trying to get in for other reasons, everything is treated with the same hand. Is that somewhat accurate, that description?
Yes, it is. And I would add that for all of those other folks who are coming in, like me, I came in to this country with a 3-month tourist visa that my family and I overstayed, and then I was undocumented for 8 years of my life. Um, there, if there was ways for the rest of us to come in legally, we would do that. It's not like we didn't think of that. It's just that the law, like I said earlier, has gotten stricter and stricter for family-based migration. We always talk about a push-pull. When there is a pull and a push factor, there will always be migration. The pull is, frankly, in the United States, that there's this idea that you will find work, and frankly, you will. And then the push factor is that the economies, the human rights abuses in our home countries are often pushing us out of our communities. In places like what we're seeing right now with asylum seekers, in places like Central America, the human rights abuses, the frankly civil war, the poverty is so intense that it is pushing people towards our borders. And they're literally knocking on our door saying, please help us, please help me and my family, please help my children. And so then what we do with border policy is we say, you know what, we're not going to frankly welcome anybody in a friendly manner or in an easy, accessible manner, like many other borders across the world. And we push people to dangerous parts of the desert. We push people in desperation to cross between ports of entry. We force people to do desperate things like climb walls and try to cross undetected to some of the most dangerous parts of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan Desert. And so what we are doing is creating like this entire basically shadow culture where people are having to do certain things to try to get here and find a better life. And then that's not even, Doug, we haven't even talked about the 11 million undocumented Americans that live in the United States, that have lived in the United States for decades, that have roots here, that have children, maybe even grandchildren, that have businesses, that have set roots in their communities. Border policy doesn't address any of them.
Yeah. It's really, that your comments about if there was a line, we would get in the line. I'm putting words in your mouth, but there is no line. That's shocking news to people. They don't know. Someone named Shafa in our comments is saying that she's also seeking asylum. She's had an asylum case open since 2015 and is still waiting for a hearing. The fact that if you're seeking asylum or you're seeking migration to the United States, that it's so backlogged. I think I read recently that the current time frame, if you want to get in line from Mexico, is 23 years or something like this. And then that line's not even really definable. It's if people have felt the frustration of trying to get the vaccine and they're like, I don't even know where to go, or I don't even know if I'm on a list. Imagine that your life is that you're trying to live in another country. Maybe you have family members, or maybe you have reasons that you want to live there. Maybe it's for your own safety. And you're basically told you can't come in and there's no legal way for you to get in line. The line doesn't exist. You can't. So when people say, well, folks are jumping the line or they're cheating the system, we've created a situation where we want immigrants in this country. We need immigration in this country. And yet we can't seem to create a process by which people can immigrate to the United States, let alone seek asylum or be cared for as a refugee if they're seeking those kinds of status. This has only been amplified, because of COVID, and then because of the Trump administration's basically stop taking in refugees and asylum seekers from anywhere in the world approach. But frankly, across the board, our system has not created a mechanism by which people can comfortably and naturally immigrate and migrate. What I know you don't have all the power to fix all this yet, but what is the answer to this? Like, is it to increase immigration numbers so that we would go from letting in, a few 100,000 a year to numbers of millions? Is it hiring more people to run the system? Is it all of the things that people raise? What do you think the answer to this is?
Yeah, I actually think it's a little bit of all of that. And I think what the United States needs to realize is that we have had a hand in creating economic turmoil and political turmoil in many countries, many third world countries, particularly like Central America. And so we are now facing the backlash of all of that, which has been mass migration. NAFTA created mass migration out of Mexico in the 1990s, which is why my family came here. And then we saw mass migration. And then with mass migration, we saw stricter immigration laws. We saw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. Now we're seeing this mass migration from Central America. And we keep reacting to this issue the same way by making it tougher to come here as opposed to the other way around. And given the realities of climate change, we will start seeing more and more climate refugees and people who are escaping their home countries because climate change has impacted them so severely. And so, and yet the United States is one of the lead contributors to climate change, right? So we are at the forefront of causing demise and not then accepting the people who are being impacted by it. So yeah, I think it's a lot of things. I mean, even in potentially Shafa's case, depending on where they are, here in the El Paso region, that encompasses basically all of New Mexico, I think you have like a 1% chance of your asylum case actually being approved. You go over to the next district, maybe it's an 8% chance, right? So the system is really stacked against people. Like there is really, people say that the system is broken. A lot of us in this work believe that the system is actually working exactly as it was intended. We need cheap labor. We need people to pick our crops and work in our food manufacturers, people who now we've deemed essential because of the pandemic. Yet we are not willing to take a pretty incredible step forward in saying, how do we, number one, help create a pathway for the 11 million undocumented Americans that live here? And number two, how do we clear a path forward by increasing those visa diversities, those visa numbers, by putting more capacity towards the courts? And I don't just mean with more judges, because often we know judges also have biases, but I also mean caseworkers. I mean people who understand trauma, people who will welcome people at our borders that are not law enforcement, that are not Border Patrol or ICE. And so, again, I don't work directly with asylum seekers, but I know a lot of friends that do, that absolutely have the answers. You ask me about immigration reform and about how to not militarize the border, I will tell you exactly how to do that. I will tell you how to use those billions of dollars in our community that have nothing to do with walls and Border Patrol and checkpoints. But the asylum situation is so complex, but there are people who can detangle it for you, and there are people who have the solutions.
Yeah, and look, it's complicated. Even when people realize that there's separate categories for somebody who's seeking to immigrate versus someone who's a refugee from another country and someone who's an asylum seeker. These are three separate legal categories that sometimes overlap, but they really matter. And all of them are underfunded, right? All of them don't have enough people working on it. One of the solutions that I've seen that Democrats in Congress have put forward is to spend the money better, like to take some level of efficiency to solve the approach of efficiency to solve the problems, like have the right people doing the right kind of work. And frankly, just have more immigration courts, have a different process for adjudicating someone's claim seeking immigration or asylum or refugee status. To your point that this is working as intended, it really does seem that way, doesn't it? I mean, because we could put money to the things that we want to put money to. We figured out during COVID, boy, you can transition a facility into all kinds of uses if you want to. You could open up hundreds and hundreds of migration and asylum seeking court proceedings all over the country with judges and lawyers and referees to make these decisions. And that's something that only the federal government can do, right? Like you as a council person in Las Cruces, New Mexico, that's not something you can solve.
No.
It's really only somebody in Congress and people, I guess, inside the immigration, homeland security side of the apparatus that really does have to solve this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we have, if you think about it, let's say a member of Congress from Southern California, Southern Arizona, Southern New Mexico, who we're not going to count on her to do any of this. And then Southern Texas, right? There is a very small cohort of people who will go to Washington, D.C. to actually do the work of our people. And, it is our role. And I think you met some of the folks in the Southern Border Communities Coalition, who I want to give them a huge shout out to, because when I think about experts, this group of people really is it. And we're a network of networks from San Diego to Brownsville, who we live and breathe border governance and border policy. And all we're asking from this new administration, we've met with Secretary Mayorkas, which was just such a radical shift from the last 4 years that we even had that little bit of access. But we're asking policymakers, people who are elected or appointed, to consult with us, because we have the answers, we have the experiences to match everything that they're talking about in Washington, D.C. And while Las Cruces City Council absolutely does not have the authority to change any of this, we certainly will have the capacity to answer some questions to some of the challenges being posed. And like I said earlier, right, the Department of Homeland Security is one of the most well-funded agencies in the country. And, they both include Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, and then ICE, and they're very well-funded. And so we keep putting dollars towards enforcement as opposed to welcoming measures, and that is frankly a problem. And actually, Doug, before I forget, you also mentioned the idea of more courts, right? Immigration courts that do this right, because immigration is a civil matter. I don't know if I took you all when you were here to Operation Streamline, but Operation Streamline is a criminal process that was started in 2005 when a migrant is caught crossing the border between ports of entry by a Border Patrol agent, for example, they are now put into criminal proceedings. So if you're caught crossing the border unlawfully, you're put into a criminal procedure that is deemed Operation Streamline. And this only happens in border communities and border districts. If it's your first time, if it's your first offense, you are up for a federal misdemeanor, punishable up to 6 months in federal prison, which is most likely privatized. So we have another thing driving the strict immigration laws there. If it's more than once, it is a federal felony, punishable up to 20 years in prison. We'd like to say that this literally criminalized the American dream. And we have put so much money into this court system, again, stricter. We think that, the United States has taken this approach that the more barriers we build to coming here, deterrence, right, then people will stop coming. But what we haven't stopped is people getting hired in ag industries and construction industries, and we haven't stopped that pull force. But we're now building policies to deter people from coming here that frankly aren't working and are criminalizing immigrants. They're criminalizing our brothers and sisters. And I just think we've really, really failed when it's come to, border governance.
And that shift from it being a civil case that you're in the country without approved of documentation to be in the country, that's different than what they did with this Operation Streamline, where they've now made it a criminal action to come in between two borders, someplace that's not one of the official spots.
Correct.
And is that something, to what you know, that the Biden administration can change, or was that a congressional law that was passed? Do you know, like, is that an enforcement, like Justice Department narrative, or where's the solution to shutting down those courts and moving all of that to processing, instead of processing people as criminals, like process them as immigrants, like create a line that people could be in so that they could migrate to the United States?
Yes, I think it would require congressional approval, but it could really be championed by the president. Actually, Castro was running on this, on getting rid of 1325 and 1326, which is what it is in the code. And it's that federal misdemeanor and that federal felony for unlawfully coming into this country. And it could absolutely be changed. And it would just take some political will to do that.
Well, it's curious, because when I hang around my Republican friends, they'll often tell me around gun laws that we don't need more laws. Laws don't make people do the right thing. And then you go to the border and they switch positions. And all of a sudden it's like, let's just make more laws and let's criminalize. So this raises this larger issue for all of us about how do we want to solve some of our issues and problems in our country, right? What's the approach that we're going to take? Okay, let's talk a bit more now about separating. So a lot of that was, here's the immigration process problem. Here's what needs to be fixed. Border security and border governance. When I talk about, I'm one of these people that likes the phrase open borders. And by open borders, I don't mean no borders. What I mean is that the door is unlocked. The door's open. Sure, there's going to be a door. We want people to go through the door. We don't want them just, climbing through windows, but that the door is unlocked. When I go to Mexico and I get off the airplane, there's people with a smile on their face. And there's a person who makes me fill out some forms and they stamp them. And there's an agreement that we have, and I'm allowed in the country. There's a border, but it's open. When I go to Canada, treated the same way. When Canadians come to the U.S., the Mexico border, we built a wall and militarized it, put people on gunboats out in the Rio Grande. And then senators like insurrectionists supporting Ted Cruz got on one of those like he's on a duck hunt with his camouflage. And that whole kabuki theater and that whole dangerous militarization of the situation, that's what is a militarized border. So the issue to me is not closed border versus open borders. I think the competition is open borders versus militarized borders. That what we're dealing with is a militarized force that, frankly, to the people who want there to be less government control in their life, I don't think they like the idea that 100-mile ban all around the United States is actually under the governance of federal agents who can detain anyone, including American citizens, without reason or rationale. People don't even know this, that all around the country, every single border, you go from the shoreline 100 miles, and Homeland Security gets to have free reign as border security there. But we really only enforce that along this strip from Southern California through the edge of Texas, and
Correct.
It's militarized. So, okay, I've ranted about all of that, but that's a big deal, right? That when we're going to have a conversation, it shouldn't be open closed. It should be militarized, because that's what exists, or a process where the door's open and there's a way that you can come in or not be allowed in. And if we just put enough people to process all of that system, got them off of their gunboats floating around the Rio Grande and being militarized soldiers about all of this, and approaching it with that kind of hostility. You and I have gone through border checkpoints before, and because people looked like me, we're just waved right through. Internal border checkpoints, 100 miles inside the United States. The federal government is checking your ID to see if you're the right kind of person. And other people then, are inside of militarized checkpoints inside the United States. Doesn't make sense that we've turned our southern border into militarization. So what's the answer? Because I don't have it. I just have opinions about this, I think. But what do you think the answer is to what a border governance would look like if it's not militarized? And maybe it's not open. I don't want to put open borders in your mouth. That's me. That's the approach that I have.
That's you. That's Doug. I didn't say that, everybody. No. Can I just say, though, I love that someone in Minnesota is ranting about this, because it just means that I've done my job, right? And so I'm very excited about it. And you are right. Minnesota is actually also a border state. When you consider Florida, for example, where Senator Ted Cruz, he's from Texas. Florida, Texas, well, and then the hypocrisy of Ted Cruz going to Cancun, to take his family for refuge during that, the hypocrisy of it all. Mm-hmm. But I digress. 2/3 of the United States population live in the border, technically, right? As the Department of Homeland has established. All of Florida technically is in the border zone, in the 100-mile border zone. That you are absolutely right. Agents within Department of Homeland Security have quite a bit of authority within this 100-mile zone. What also happens in this 100-mile zone is that there are internal border patrol checkpoints. So you have ports of entry, right, at the line where you cross and you give your passport, you give your visa, and then you're allowed to come into this country. Well, about 15 miles north of Las Cruces, where I live, 15 miles east, 15 miles west, there are internal border patrol checkpoints. You will be stopped again. People who look like me will be stopped more often than people who look like Doug. People who are darker than me will be stopped even more often and asked more intrusive questions about your worthiness, is how I see it, whether you are worthy of being here or not. And so, again, I believe deeply that, especially now as a elected official myself, that budgets are moral documents, and they tell your community what you value and who you value. And so the things that you put more money towards are the things that you are telling me you value more. Mm. And in this country, we value militarization. We value violence, and we value a lot less those who are suffering, those who are vulnerable, those who are in the margins. And those margins, frankly, exist because we built these sort of systems, right? We've built these budgets that have excluded communities, and the border is no stranger to that. And so, Europe does borders very differently than we do. I think we can definitely look, like I said at the beginning of this, we don't have to reinvent any wheels. Like, people do this in good ways and maybe in bad ways. And so we can adopt those things. And I saw someone in the comments say something about, well, what about Mexico? And people talk to me about all the time. And all I usually say is, since when do we take policy advice from Mexico, right? So how about we, look inward, and instead of pointing fingers at other countries, we sort of try to figure out where it is that we went wrong and who's been missing at the table, who has been missing at the table when we've made decisions about certain communities. And border communities have been for far too long missing at the decision-making table. Mm.
Mm. When I saw the statistic, and I've spent a lot of time now inside the statistics of how many people, this and that, in 2019, persons who obtained lawful permanent resident status, so that's something you might call like permanent immigration, right, was 1,031,765 from all the countries. 1 million. I mentioned this to somebody, and they said, wow, that's a lot. We have 350 million people in this country. 1,000,000, 1/350th of our total population is not a big number. So much of this, in addition to the militarization and trying to tell us that we should be afraid, that there's hordes of dangerous people coming in the country, which the former president of the United States claimed, that's its own problem. The fact that we only are issuing in 2019 a million permanent resident status. I don't know what the number should be, but this notion that if you increased immigration, everyone in the world would want to come to the United States. Now, Johana, your family did. My family did, I don't know, 300 years ago or something. But not everybody wants to come. Like, there is a way to increase the numbers, to demilitarize the border, and not be totally overwhelmed or somehow believe. And I talked to some very progressive people the other day about this issue, and they started to recite the very same phrases about, well, but all those people are going to come in and overwhelm the safety net. They're going to overwhelm the schools. And this idea, somehow, for some reason, and I don't want to be hard on Americans here for a second. I don't mean to be, but sometimes we fall into this fragility narrative. Like, we couldn't possibly deal with 5 million immigrants in a year. Like, you could put 5 million immigrants across this country in places. You could revitalize farm communities. You could revitalize failing small towns. You could have an increased tax base. You would have new workers. You'd have new like, why we get into this narrative primarily around migration that is counterfactual and is rooted in, we have to be afraid. Does this go back to 2001? Like, is this part of the war footing, Homeland Security, everyone's a terrorist, people are trying to sneak in stuff? Is that, I mean, I don't know how old you are, but now I'm reflecting, 20 years ago was 9/11, right? So there's somebody who's, 30 years old working hard on solving these problems. And that happened when they were 10, which means their entire memoried life has been inside of a militarized country. Do you feel like that's where it is? Or why is this so spun around, and why is it so militarized?
I loved that you framed it as fragility. I actually think that it's very much that, but and it's also this like scarcity. Like, Americans live in a constant sense of scarcity, and I think that it's there's very much, when in the context of the world, there's very much a privilege of being born in the United States, and perhaps never having a sense of, what if I have to leave my country? And a lot of people joked about that during the 4 years of Trump, right? And did people ultimately leave? Maybe some did, but probably very few. Unlike a lot of us who have left our home countries. And often people would ask me, where will you live if Trump wins again? And I'm like, no, I'm not leaving another country. I already did that. I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to fight to make this one the American dream my parents were sold 24 years ago. And so I really feel like people live in this sense of scarcity. Even some of the most progressive allies will get into that place of like, there is just not enough. Where are we going to get it all? And it goes back to the way we've been conditioned to invest, how we've been conditioned to invest in people. And someone on here put something about borders aren't the problem. It's international poverty and inequity and violent persecution. That also happens here within our borders. All of that happens here. The United States is not immune to violent persecution. The United States is not immune to inequities in our legal system. You just mentioned what is happening today in Minnesota with George Floyd. We are not immune to poverty. And so now that I'm 32, I've been reflecting on a lot about the idea of the American dream. And I feel like I'll speak for myself, but I feel like my family was sold a lie about the American dream. But we're here now. And my parents will probably work themselves to the bone, like many other Americans, because that's what we've said the American dream is, right? And we have an economy that you have to prove your worth to it. And I think that breeds this sense of scarcity in the United States. And so I think even for the most well-intentioned people, you just go back to that. And I think it's a really hard thing to try to get rid of within your own personal life, but certainly in policymaking.
I think back to the 1980s, which I barely remember, and a big debate between two candidates running for the Republican presidential nomination, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. So this is before the 1980 election, which Reagan ultimately won. They were having, and there's this famous YouTube video where you can watch this, in one of their debates, they were one-upping one another on who, as a Republican, was going to be better and more inclusive of more immigration in the United States. It was a Republican commitment to be best on immigration and to be sure they were letting both in. So they both had plans, and Reagan was arguing that his plan was better to let in more immigrants than George Bush's, and George Bush was saying that his was. So something changed. Right now in 2021, that seems fanciful. You couldn't even get two Democrats to be arguing with each other about who was going to let in more immigrants, right?
We're having a hard time doing a vote count in the Senate for DREAM Act, right? Like, I don't know if there's going to be 10 Republicans to vote in favor of the DREAM Act.
The DREAM Act, which 9 years ago, they were in favor of, right? So it tells you that politicians change and parties change, and the commitment. And look, as somebody who works with the identity around voters and what voter identity means, most all of us, we don't pick our positions on every important topic to politics into our civic life. This is much more like buying the combo meal, right? It just comes with a drink and fries. So somebody picks the Republican Party and they just get a bunch of other beliefs that come along with it. Then they spend their time trying to rationalize why Republicans are right, and Democrats do the same thing. So granting that most of us, we're not all that briefed up on all the things that people like us think, or that we even think. But our beliefs have been handed to us politically, religiously, civically, all kinds of things. But every once in a while, we take a look and you realize, oh, the parties have shifted positions. Something has changed. And immigration is one of those. And it's because people ran for office, started to say different things, and then more people started to join them what they're saying. It's actually the way democracy works. We elect new people and they say other things, and pretty soon the belief system starts to shift and change. This is my transition to why you ran for city council member in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And you're among the people who want to change this story so that 30 or 40 years from now, people will look back and say, do you remember when it was like this at the border, when we approached it like this? Like, I'm sure that there's people that you work with all the time who remember when there wasn't a big, obnoxious, ugly, militarized, rusting wall on that border that you and I went to, and you showed us how to look through the slats and look into the eyes and touch the hands of kids living in Mexico and families in Mexico through this obnoxious border, when it used to be basically a small fence and there was connection and commerce and animals could get through, and wildlife and waters and rivers and people, and there was natural flow, and there was a way of living with one another. Then politicians and activists changed it and built walls and bragged about it. Some of them made it their whole thing. You saying that you came to the United States and you feel like this wasn't really the dream we were promised is part of the reason you ran for the city council in Las Cruces, because you want to make this country closer to that dream that you were promised?
That is pretty much on the dot, Doug. I actually, part of my stump speech, if you will, was about 24 years ago, my parents made a pretty tough decision to come to the United States. And actually, my dad he was in the United States the last time we saw Pathway to Citizenship in the 1980s. And that is how my dad got his green card. Of course, that ended, and it took a really long time for my mom, my little brother, and I to be naturalized. But as maybe a millennial too, I as someone who organizes, who thinks about this all of the time, I've never told my parents that I feel like we were fed a lie with the American dream. I think they would be very angry at me if I ever said that to them. But 24 years later, my dad has children that were born here. He has a granddaughter now. He owns a business. And often I feel like he still feels like a guest in this country. And to me, that's heartbreaking. And I ran for office because I would absolutely like to be part of a group of like-minded people in this country who are trying to restore that. I don't even know if restoring is the right word. Everything I've learned about civil rights in this country and the history, I'm not sure we're trying to restore anything, but I absolutely believe that we can build something new. And the minute that I stop believing that is the minute I should stop organizing, and probably the minute I should retire from politics, because I feel like it's actually really hard to be an activist or an organizer. It takes a lot of political imagination and creativity to believe that we can create something new. And I absolutely deeply believe that. And you know what? Federal, national politics are gross sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. They're nasty and ugly. Local politics are beautiful. Local politics, we're talking about getting our roads paved. We're talking about how to bring mental health care access to people who need it the most. I'm talking to people about revitalizing a corridor in our city. Like these things, people, you walk outside and you feel that. And it feels so much closer and personal than national politics, even though that's where all the fire and glitz is. Yeah. Local politics are honestly really beautiful. And it's been a hard year, I'm not going to lie. But I'm also just so deeply grateful that I'm here. And it feels like I'm supposed to be here.
There was a period of time when in the 1890s when immigration was going to fuel this nation, right? And big ports of entry were created on the eastern coast. And there was even a statue representing liberty that was put up, with that famous quote poem on it that includes the phrase, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Like, that was an imagination in America of migrants and immigration. And give us those who struggle and we'll make a nation of them. And now it's not like that. We talk about other things like, hey, yeah, sure, increase immigration, but keep out the people that are going to be a burden. Like, it's almost the opposite, right? It's the mirror image of that narrative. And so now, did we ever live up to that? Not by my estimation, or I think by history's record, but it was the impulse. Have we lived up to this closed border, build a wall, keep everyone out? Well, fortunately not all together, but it's the impulse. And one of the things that we realize is that the impulses we have matter, like how we think about it and how we talk about it and who it is that talks about it. That's why your voice and your role, whether it's a community organizer or with faith workers, or trying to figure out streets and roundabouts and a more gracious schooling and food programs in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Like that's literally how we get there. The things about our systems and structures is that they're made by people. They're handcrafted. Everything's house made in this country, right? We make it. So if it exists, it's because someone made it. If there's a law, someone wrote it and someone voted for it. And if you want to change it, the beauty is we are not fighting against the laws of nature here. We're fighting against the laws that somebody wrote. or didn't write, or the vote that they didn't take, or the poem that they didn't live up to, or the right. So I just, Johana, I'm a big fan of yours and the work that you do, and the fact that you ran for office as someone who would be in the target's eye, right? And that you're bold about your story, and you say, look, my family came, we overstayed a work visa, and then we had to find our way. Like, there's people who don't want people telling that story at all, right? I'm sure some people heard you say that on this podcast and like, oh my goodness, she said that. Like, I thought people kept all that quiet. Can you say a bit about that? Like, that this passion and desire to change and to make it new, but then also telling the truth about what's going on and telling the truth about your own story and not hiding it away and saying, look, this is how it was for me. Is that how is that for you? What brought that about, and how is it?
That is a very much a community organizing learning. In community organizing, it is absolutely about our lived experience and our truth and our story of self. And often we say, people can argue statistics with you all day long. They can argue numbers with you, but that is my lived reality. You cannot argue with me the very thing that I lived through. And we get to own that, and we get to command power over that story. And the moments that we don't are the moments that somebody else will tell that story on our behalf. Wow. And people, politicians in this country have been telling the story of immigrants for a really long time, and they've been doing so very flawed. And we've created a deserving immigrant and an undeserving immigrant. And part of sharing my story is breaking that dominant narrative that exists about who we are as people. And I would argue that everyone who's lived in the margins at one point, if we tell that story more and more, we actually make it a societal problem. Poverty is a perfect example. That dominant narratives exist about poor folks all over this country. How we talk about poor people is so awful. And for folks who live in poverty, when you talk about what that has meant for you, first of all, we do tell people all the time, actually, it's your fault. If you're poor, it's because you made bad choices. If you're an immigrant, it's because you made bad choices. So you better not talk about it. You better live in shame and silence, because that's how the system will thrive, honestly. And so more and more in organizing, and now that I have this platform as an elected official, I want to encourage people more and more to tell that story and to own it and to say it to the highest of governance. This is my reality, and we can begin creating a counter narrative to the very narrative that has created these systems.
Yeah, and when people recognize that you are the face that they're talking about when they say, well, people come in the country and overstay, and then they become a burden. Like, really? Okay, I'm sure. But look, a lot of people I grew up with who were born right here, just up the street here in Minneapolis area, they're a burden to our society. Like, yes, there are people who become a burden to our society. And then there are people who aren't. And there's some of us who are a burden for a while, and then we're not. And then we not for a while, and then we need a little help. So these are the faces of the people, right? This is the shared common experience. This is the common good part of this. And that we've lost a sense of the common in our immigration. It is really significant. So I just think for anybody who wants to think about these issues, getting to the border and seeing what life looks like inside that ring, especially in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas, like it's particular there. It is wonderful, and it's beautiful, and you begin to realize this one anotherness that is so essential to our human expression and anything that we're trying to put together in this country as the way human beings live with each other. It has to involve this one anotherism. And so we're going to be going. Vote Common Good's going to spend time along the border this fall. We're just getting ready to announce this, so we'll say a little word about it now. But between September 11th and November 13th, we're going to be between the border of between San Diego and St. Augustine, Florida, on the East Coast. So going from our own East Coast to West Coast all along our southern border in a trek. So we're going to be moving ourselves along, take about 65 days. Lots of us are going to do it on bicycles. So we're going to ride it. Other people will ride in cars. There'll be lots of wheels rolling, and there's a wheel for you if you want to come. And the reason we do this is because, to your point earlier, that proximity, Johana, is the power of this, right? It takes away the otherism and it takes away the narrative. And I think once people see the wall and they see the people, and frankly, they meet the militarized immigration patrols too, and you look these people in the eye and you ask them to reclaim their humanity and not just hide behind their military status and their flak jackets and flashlights and weapons, trying to break through these dehumanizing narratives that have been put together. It's a little bracing when people realize there's such beauty and solutions in people, and then you're also met with the fact that the United States of America has a militarized border that looks like places in other parts of the world that we never would have imagined. It's so important. So we want to invite people to consider being a part of this trek for a day, for a week, I don't know, for 65 days, whatever the days are that you have for this. Anything else you want to talk about of what people will see if they come to the beauty that is New Mexico and Las Cruces, or to the other places along that border?
Yes, absolutely. I hope people do come visit. And the wall and the checkpoints that I know I talked a lot about today, they're actually such a tiny piece of our communities. They're a big burden. That's a burden, right? Those things are actually burdens, but we keep investing in them. The reality is that our community is incredibly welcoming. We have here in Las Cruces a huge, beautiful national monument called the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks. That is just an incredible site. We have honestly pretty incredible food here. So if you come, you must try the question of New Mexico is red or green, depending on how you like your chile, whether red or green. And so you must try something like that. And you must check out and ensure you're outside for our sunsets. And that is really, and I get a little emotional thinking about how much I love this place, because for an immigrant in this country, it could take a lifetime. Some people may never find it. I fear that my dad will never find that sense of home again. But I did. I found it here in Las Cruces, and we're happy to share it with people in a more genuine way than policy does.
People are asking if there's ways to be connected. And yeah, if you want to donate to this work that we're going to be doing, the ones that we've been talking about here, you can go to voteCommonGood.com. There's a donation link there. But also we organize nmnewmexico.org. That's the URL. Do I have it right? We organize NM. That's the organization that Johana runs as executive director. And she's mentioned she's also a city council member in Las Cruces. But we organize NM.
It's fascinating. Doug, it's actually just organize NM. www.organizenm.org.
Thank you. That's a place for you to see what they're doing, to get connected, to find this beautiful story of what's happening. So Johana, so good to see you. Say hi to all the good people. I know this is a difficult question to end on, but are you a red or green chili person when you're ordering your New Mexican food?
To be really honest with you, a lot of people would tell you Christmas, which is the combination, but I'm red. I'm red all the way.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll stay friends. I'm green, but okay. So we'll solve that salsa battle, that chili battle, another time. So if you have a chance, anyone, to get to New Mexico, do it. When you do, find the city councilwoman from Las Cruces and say hello. And thanks for being with us here. We talk about news on Mondays. On Tuesday, it's politics. So join us on Tuesday. Rob Ryerson and I lead that conversation. On Wednesday, we're joined by 3 other pastors and myself, Laura Truax, Stephanie Spalding, Dominique Gilliard, and we talk about faith. How can we find a common good faith? We pick up particular issues on Thursday that matter in our society, kind of big framed issues. And then we talk science and economics on Fridays. So we try to keep us alive and moving because we want people to make the common good their voting criteria. And often that means rethinking all of these kinds of issues. So good to have Johana on today. Thanks for being with us. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast because you watch online, head over and subscribe to the podcast wherever you do that. And if you're new to podcasting or you don't, when people say things like all the podcast apps and you don't know what that means, you can just go to votecommongood.com/podcast and we walk you through all of it so you can see it there. And if you listen to this on the podcast version and you're still listening now and haven't moved on to another one while we're at the end credits, thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Send us a note sometime over at podcast@votecommongood.com. Let us know you listen and, like it and share it and do all the rest of that. So Johana, again, thank you for being with us today, and everybody will see you tomorrow.
Thank you.